This is Archaeo-Death, an exploration in the archaeology of death and memory, past and present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Welcome, Archaeo-Deathlings, to another Archaeo-Death interview, and we're into dynamic, exciting new territories that are going far beyond the material culture of past times today. And I'm excited to be joined from across the pond with Gareth. Gareth is here with us, and it's a bit of a weird story how we come to meet each other via multiple social media platforms. But before we get into that, Gareth, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Gareth Roberts. I'm originally from Dorchester. Now I am in Philadelphia. Have been for 10 years now. And I'm a linguist. I'm interested in language evolution, broadly speaking. So I actually teach a course on, how we got to the grand story of how we got from being a species, not having language, to being a species with all the languages we have now. But most of my research is really on language change, that sort of thing, where change comes from in language, that kind of question generally. I'm not. Well, I know we're going to be talking a bit about Old English, and I'm not an expert on Old English in particular. But I don't spend my research time scouring corpora of Old English looking for specific words, anything like that. But I am a linguist, and it sort of overlaps with my expertise, and thankfully other people have done a very great work on that. So
and it's that breadth of the relevance of your research and teaching that hits with this topic, because this topic has been bombarded at me regularly on social media, and that's how it started. So I did a post, I can't remember what my TikTok post was about, and someone just rocks up in the comments, which happens quite regularly, and says, what do you think about the word Welsh, and is it derogatory, and should we change the name of the country, the people? Should we stop using this foreign word that means foreign or means slave, and it's inherently insulting? And I tried to be diplomatic, and I just said I'm aware of the debates, and that wasn't good enough. And people were coming at me in the comments saying, you need to read this Twitter X thread by Gareth Roberts, and I went, okay, and so I did a follow-up post trying to do my best, but I thought, rather than try to pretend to be an expert in something I literally don't have the expertise in, but it's such a hot topic people want to know, I thought, why don't we just set up a chat so you can explain the issues I can't? So that's, I mean, but why is this topic important now, do you think, Gareth? What's going on with the word Welsh right now that's made it such a social media buzz?
So right now, I think what's happening is people are talking a lot about, maybe we can stop using. I think it really started maybe more with other place names, apart not Wales and Welsh so much, but names like Brecon Beacons or
Yes.
Snowdonia and so on, right? So and there was a national parks started switching and deciding they were just going to use the Banabrycheiniog in the case of Brecon Beacons, and Uddy in the case of Snowdonia and so on. And that became a bit of a hot topic. And around the same time in the background, people had also been, for a while, off and on, a little bit, some people had been a little bit uncertain about the word Welsh and using it of ourselves and seeing it as maybe not a term that a lot of Welsh people feel perhaps entirely happy with. So I think that kind of re-emerged in this context. And so I know people, for instance, online who prefer to refer to Wales as Cymru in English and Cymraeg instead of Welsh and so on. So I think it's that kind of context which has really brought this big question of the etymology of the word to the fore.
And certainly where I've come at it as someone who long-term resident in Wales, and then, well, I've Welsh ancestry, but grew up in England, moved to 2 jobs in Wales, then moved back to England, then back to, well, I'm in England now, but I'm 1.4 kilometres from the Welsh border. Who knows what Chester really is. I like to think it's just an extension, should be Welsh again, but but I go back across the border every day, and it's on social media terms, people get very, every time I say Cymru, or occasionally do the jokey mispronunciation, call it Cymru, just to watch people get angry. I don't do that, I promise I don't really, but I'm almost tempted to do it just to go, because I see people the rage. But my point is, I see people go, oh, it's great that you used hashtag Cymru, and I go, oh, I just tried to sort of mix it up, but people are really passionate about this, and so but the tagline, the shorthand is, it has always meant foreigner slave, and I've kind of gone but I tried to go into it in my video, but I really want to get sort of a deep dive from you as to
Sure.
where does it come from, and what happened to the word?
Sure.
How did it evolve?
Sure, and I think you did a pretty good job in your video, by the way. I should say, start off by saying that. But
thank you.
So I will I will in fact be recapitulating parts of what you said, but I'll hopefully add a bit more detail and a bit more depth as you were asking. So I mean, originally, where the story really starts off is there's this Celtic tribal confederacy in Europe called the Walkai or the Volkai, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And the name they gave themselves, this seems to be a name that they applied to themselves. It seems to mean something like hawks. And it seems to be cognate with modern Welsh gwalch, hawk or falcon, which in modern Welsh, in fact, can mean rascal, or I've not heard it very sort of recently in modern Welsh being used to mean sort of brave warrior, but it seems to have had that sort of meaning as well in Welsh. So it's got that kind of, originally, you know, it seems to be a Celtic word which was used by speakers of Celtic languages to refer to their own confederacy, or whatever the term we want to use for that is. I believe tribal confederation is probably the term people seem to prefer to use to refer to them. That's more of a question, I guess, for the historians and archaeologists than for the linguists. But they were known, of course, to Germanic speakers in Europe, and those Germanic speakers, at a certain point, adopted the name of this group. And you started to use it initially, I guess, to refer to them in particular, but then it broadened to refer to likely speakers of Celtic languages a bit more generally. And we see similar things happening now, right? We see the way the word English is used to refer to British people more generally very often. And also, there's the words in some Asian languages which mean sort of Westerner or European, which come from the word Frank. You know, so this is not uncommon for a word for a specific group of people to come to be broadened in that sense.
Do we have any, I try to interrupt, but do we have any kind of time scale? This is really rough, isn't it? Well, we're talking about at the time of just before and during the expansion of the Roman Empire, or late Roman Republic. You know, is that the kind of?
That's the idea. Yeah, that's my understanding. Is we're talking about the kind of late Roman Republic era at that point, right? But then we have, of course, changes that happen as Rome kind of expands. Right. So what ultimately happens, of course, is that these speakers of Celtic languages in Western Europe, because of Rome's expansion, come increasingly to be Latin speakers, and the difference between Celt and Roman in Western Europe becomes a bit blurry for a number of people, and I think my understanding, not only for outsiders. I mean, there seems to be. I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be said about the identity of the Britons and other Western Europeans once we get to the point that towards the end of the Western Roman Empire and so on, and past that. You know, I think there's an interesting question about the extent to which Britons and Welsh people thought of themselves in a certain sense very often as kind of Roman for quite a long time after the end of the Roman Empire. As I understand it, again, this is a question really for the historians and archaeologists more than for the linguists. But this is something I find
strong views in different ways about how much the British people saw themselves as the inheritors of Rome, and I kind of just present it both to my students now, but passionate views. But but it's an interesting issue. But that sense of identity that is still, we are the true inheritors of that culture, that language, but also particularly the material world. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah,
exactly. And I find that sort of question about, and of course there's going to be lots of variation historically in that. But anyway, this word which had been adopted into the Germanic languages as a Welsh seems to be the reconstructed Germanic root. That by the time we get to the Romans having left Britain, and we have these speakers of Germanic languages moving into Britain, using the word in Old English, we know usually as Welsh, spelled W-E-A-L-H. that word seems at that point to have meant something like, I've seen it glossed as, I think probably a reasonable gloss for it would be inhabitant of the Western Roman Empire, something like that. It's a term for those people who might be speaking typically Celtic languages or Latin languages, increasingly Latin, who inhabited the western part of Europe, including Britain.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because can I interrupt again at that point? Because when people were soundbiting and saying, "Oh, it meant Roman," of course, that has so many layered connotations in the modern mind. I kind of went, "Ooh." But yes, I mean Roman in the sense of inhabitant of the empire. Imperial sounds like something out of Star Wars. I wouldn't say that, but people of the empire is a slightly different connotation from Roman. But you know, it gets the job done in describing. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
No, exactly, and I think in certain cases it does seem to have been used to mean essentially Roman. And that's not a bad translation in certain cases. In other cases, it's going to mean something a little bit different. So you do see references where, if I remember correctly, there's a term where it uses the word richa, meaning empire, and the adjective used to describe it is related to the word well, so to mean Roman Empire essentially. So it does verge on, it doesn't overlap with the word Roman essentially. The word Roman, equivalent to the word Roman, was also used in Old English. So it's there's this sort of complex space of terms which are being used, right? But of course, over time, in the context of Britain, this term came ultimately to be a term to refer to, first of all, not just any sort of inhabitant of Western Europe, but it narrowed to refer to the Britons in particular, and ultimately to a particular group of Britons, people inhabiting what we now call Wales. Word Wales just means Welsh people, basically.
So that's where your beef is with the simplifying it down to meaning foreigners, because it's never used for the Picts, it's never used for the Scotty, the Irish, the inhabitants of the other Celtic speaking peoples. I don't know if that term is allowed in this conversation. I don't know what the taboos of these crude terms are. Yeah, but it's more specific.
It's not. It is used somewhat widely for speakers of Romance and Celtic languages. So you see cognates of it in various places in Europe, in other Germanic and then Slavic languages, like in, of course, the Walloons in Belgium, the Welsh as a term in the German, used in Switzerland to refer to Romance speakers in Switzerland, Wallachia or Wallachia in Romania, also speakers of Romance language. The Polish word for Italy, in fact, is Włochy, which is of the same origin. And for my money, the most surprising one, simply because of where we might think the word comes from, is the word Gaul, to refer to historical territory of France, essentially, because the Latin word was Gallia. And we might assume that the word Gaul in modern French and borrowed into English as Gaul is of the same origin, but in fact it's not. It's not a descendant of Latin Gallia. It is in fact an unrelated word related to the word Welsh. So the term does get used in a number of different places in Europe. But then within the British context, of course, and other contexts got narrowed in different specific contexts. And it's not used either. It's not used to refer to Slavs or Greeks or Scandinavians or anything like that. It very much seems to be specifically, if you look at all these examples, specifically really Romance speakers. Plus, because Britain is the place where people came out of the Western Roman Empire speaking a Celtic language, Ireland, a separate case because they were never part of the Roman Empire. We have, Britain is this exception.
This is perhaps a really dumb question, but I mean, who would have that perspective obviously the languages sound very different, but it does seem to recognize a very fundamental a sound, a style, a cadence. There's something in that, isn't there? The othering of people who may otherwise be quite different in terms of society, economy, appearance, but who there's a broad, through trade networks and the movement of people, there is a connection. People see or perhaps we're aware of of those generalities.
Yes,
really...
and I think maybe a better way of putting it is that people are aware that we have these populations who are sort of initially Celtic and then Romano-Celtic, and then the Celtic bit probably gets a bit forgotten, right? So then you think,
Yeah.
okay, these sort of Western Europeans, Romans. I think that's the sort of idea here, and then in different contexts, the term really sort of narrows to refer to the specific Romance speakers we happen to have in our sort of neighbourhood. Exactly. The other part of the story, which is probably worth bringing in, is certainly worth bringing in, is of course also in Britain. And specifically sort of West Saxon speaking part of Britain, it also came to mean slave, alongside some other words for slave. There's a very, very good, the best piece of work I know on this, in fact, is a PhD thesis by Catherine Lee Miller from the University of Leeds from 2014. Regrettably, I think she's actually left the field because it's such a great piece of work. It's really so careful, so thorough. And she talks in chapter 3 about Welsh in particular, and about the context in which this meant slave and the context it meant, Britain and so on. And this again is something we see this kind of thing happening elsewhere, where an ethnic term or term used for a particular ethnically defined or linguistically defined group of people comes to mean slave. The word slave itself is related to the word Slav. Of course, and there are other examples you and Jonas may be aware of. But this is, I think, often the narrative here, as you say, is, oh, we have this word. The word Welsh used to mean foreigner. It used to mean slave. And then it took a word meaning foreigner or slave and applied it to us. It's not quite that. It's that you have a word which was referred to Celts, Romano-Celts, Romans, inhabitants of Western Roman Empire, however we wanted, lost that, which was then applied to the people who fitted that description in Britain. And then in a particular context, it also then, on the basis of that, the basis of the people who the speakers of Old English were enslaving and how they perceived them, came to be used also to mean slave in that particular context as well.
Do we know what happened then? We know that slavery was still a thing in 10th, early mid 11th century England. What happens in that Norman? Is it in the Norman period that a real and after sort of like the late 11th, 12th, early 13th century that we see the sort of the Welsh self-conscious identity and the term being primarily for what we now understand, or is it something much longer lasting? I'm very woolly on that later medieval aspect.
It's a good question. Certainly my impression here is that it doesn't really get used to mean slave for a terribly long period. We are talking a relatively late period, not long before the Norman conquest.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the kind of dynamic in England changed quite dramatically anyway, and the how the English saw themselves changed somewhat rather dramatically, of course. As for the use of the term to refer to Wales, in particular, I'm not as clear as I should be on the timeline. I should just start off by saying that. So you see this use continuing. What had already really happened by that point is that you didn't really very much have, apart from the Cornish and the Welsh, you didn't really have well-defined communities in Britain who might be described as Welsh anymore. So what were left was you used to have Cumbria, of course. The name Cumbria comes from related Cymru. Cymric died out most likely in the sort of late Middle Ages, perhaps. It's not entirely clear when Cumbrian might have died out, but still, we're not talking a substantial community of people who might be perceived as Welsh. There was this Anglicisation process where most people in England came increasingly to be perceived as indistinguishable from the other English. That sort of distinction disappeared, as I understand it. What I have noticed is you get the term Welsh and British, for that matter, used to refer to Cornish for a bit longer than we might expect. That kind of ascended further we might expect. Of course, the wall in Cornwall is also of the same origin as the word Wales, Welsh, and so on.
It's so when we come up to the modern era, and obviously people on social media are either who may be young people who are coming across this debate, who obviously are aware of the long-term derogatory stereotypes of Welsh people, from particularly an English perspective, but also internationally, and derogatory framings that are very much the product of the last 500 years, but obviously have deeper roots. I'm not denying they have,
Sure.
being called a slave and associating that with a particular group is hardly a badge of honor. But my point is that when you get into that very intensified modern, the origins of the modern world, of capitalism, of all of the mix, and where do you feel this story should sit, and that where perhaps people are getting this wrong? Because it's one of those things for me where I must say, and it's not a criticism of any individual academic, but it seems to be such a big question that seems to be almost so big no one's kind of noticed that it needs a really clear answer like you're giving, and that it's one of those things that I was like caught on the back foot on, because it's not my field, but people are, so I'm just really keen to hear where you think, why does this matter to people today? What is the message for people today from this story of an evolving word?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, I think part of the message here is that we should probably treat the etymology and the question of how we want to refer to ourselves as Welsh people as somewhat distinct questions, right? As a linguist, I care about getting the etymology right, whatever, whatever's going on. Regardless of the question of whether we should call ourselves Welsh or Cymru or whatever in English, I don't want to be making the argument on bad grounds. I think we get the etymology right. I think one thing I think we want to be clear on is that, on the one hand, even given the history of the term, and even if we were to, for example, even if it were the case that the word had historically meant foreigner before it meant Welsh, and that this had been, it doesn't necessarily mean that the term is problematic for us today to use of ourselves. We might very happily reclaim it. There's many words get reclaimed and people very happily use it of themselves. Alternatively, even were there no negative connotations at all to the term, we might decide we don't really want to use it anymore. It's a term, regardless of how it might have been used in the past, it is a term which, for most of the history of Wales, Welsh people has not been the main term we've used of ourselves. We've, until pretty recently, most people in Wales spoke Welsh. Till pretty recently, most people in Wales were monolingual Welsh speakers. And we've tended to refer to ourselves as Cymru. So I think these are really two separate questions. I think that's what I see most here. That I think there's a discussion to be had about what we call ourselves as Welsh people in English, and where the word comes from. But I don't think that the argument that it once meant foreigner holds much water, because it didn't. That's not a very accurate account of the history of the word. It is true that the word, under certain specific contexts, was used to refer to slaves, and then I think in that case we might be concerned about that. But we're also talking, we are at the same time, I guess, talking about a rather short period in a very specific place. It's not the case that generally, when people have referred to Welsh people in English, they have associated Welsh people with slaves in that context. So I think that's also something which I think sometimes gets assumed in this discussion.
So I think our responsibility as an academic is to make sure people understand. So if they're informed of the story, they're not being duped into various simplified rhetorics from either side, saying, "Oh, it never meant this," or "It did mean that. It only meant this." It's always meant. And they have that basis of knowledge to make up their own minds, and it's a separate question. I think that's right. It's not for academics to tell people what they should in the future. But it's about having a conversation at an international and national level that is actually informed, and particularly, that seems to be a fair balance to me.
And I think it's, on the one hand, it's irritating when people make arguments on the basis of on things that aren't the case. But also, I think if you want to argue If you want to make the case that we should be calling ourselves Cymru in English, Cymraeg refers to the country as Cymru, you want to be making that argument on a good basis, because if you build your argument on a shaky foundation, well, it only takes someone to point out the shakiness of the foundation for the argument to somewhat collapse. So I think, we want to be, if we want to be making that argument, we want to be doing so on good grounds. It's a better strategy, put it that way.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of my archaeological work has been on that 5th, 6th, early 7th century period, and from an English perspective, and trying to sort of spent 25 years trying to sort of break up these sort of traditions of thinking about the Anglo-Saxons, the early English, what was going on here? How many incomers? What language? What culture? Was there ever a single monolithic Germanic group of people? But it's not denying that there wasn't a movement of people. It's about trying to make people think about how really complex patchwork and of lowland Britain was, with people that would have been perhaps called Welsh from the fens of Lincolnshire and Norfolk and Cambridgeshire and down to Sussex, Wessex, and that this wasn't simply and I think from a Welsh perspective and from a modern day English perspective, I think people forget that complex story, but equally not trying to deny there was a shifts of language at all. I'm just trying to trying to take them on that journey, that complex century-long journey, and I see people sort of flatten it and say, in the early Middle Ages, the Welsh were this. That's what it meant, and it's really. It doesn't take a long, complex, high-level academic course to just take people on that little story and explain a little bit more of the complication of it all. We have obviously DNA studies now adding to the mix, showing yes, of course there were incomers, but there are also a heck load of the Britons that are in the DNA and the culture of what was to become England by the 10th century. So it's a messy world, the early Middle Ages.
It is.
But it's trying to keep that information when people are doing the sound bites and about from, and particularly some very obviously extreme English loving types that I have to deal with, and they're not going away anytime soon, sadly. And and these conversations matter to people, don't they? Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think I think this is, it's not as if these questions of these complexities, these questions of identity, are not also familiar to us today. So many people. I'm married to an English woman. I've lived in England. I've lived in Scotland. Live in America now, and now I'm an American citizen as well as British citizen. It's the kind of sense in which we define ourselves and our identities is complex. Some Welsh people really reject the term British. Some Welsh people are quite happy to be British alongside Welsh. Some might even see themselves as primarily British, and so on. I think we're all familiar with that kind of diversity. So I think when we think a bit about that, and we think about the kind of complexity we're used to now, I think that can also be a way into thinking about, well, okay, we should probably, there's no reason to think that at any other period in history things were so much simpler.
That's very true, isn't it? I mean, we have those conversations all the time. I don't even know what to call myself. It's really funny because on social media, people start calling me Welsh, and I don't like to pretend to be something I'm not, either linguistically or culturally. But I have spent like most of my adult life living in Wales, and I contribute, through my social media to promoting the heritage and the culture in my own humble way, but I'm not sure what to call myself. So I end up getting this journey. But I was born in England, and and then people just go, but that's nature of identities. They're complicated, aren't they?
It's really tricky, and I think it's often tricky, right? Because on the one hand, you might not want to lay claim to an identity you're not entirely sure that people feel you have the same claim to, and that's not something I'm implying here. But on the other hand, you can sometimes say, you might say, for example, oh well, I'm I'm not really Welsh. People might be disappointed that you have not adopted that as your identity.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and of course I'm dealing with global audiences. It's the same thing as if you were rocking up in wherever it would be in New York City and said, oh I'm the word you would use to explain to someone you anticipate might not know is probably easier to say something like I would say, I'm from the UK, because I can't be bothered to say anything else,
Yes, well,
or
indeed.
also, oh, if I say I'm from Wales, I go, oh yeah, which county of England's that? That kind of clean. I'm sure that doesn't happen. That's probably just a myth. Please tell me that's just a myth. But
it's not too bad here, actually. People tend to have a vague idea what Wales, that there's this place called Wales somewhere over there. They might not know the details, but they have an idea.
But yes, it's all about context, isn't it? And thinking through, we're all trying to sort of just communicate with each other. So is there any takeaways you think, in sort of final points, you would think, if you are to anyone in my audience who's a student or thinking about this issue, whatever discipline they're in, if what they should be aware of with any of these term debates and linguistic debates? Any sage words of wisdom as a linguist?
It's a good question. I suppose main takeaway, I guess, is that if you don't take the kind of etymologies people share loosely online, don't take them for granted, and spend a bit of time looking them up and a bit of time reading about them. This is actually a bad example of this, I should say, because the word Welsh and the word Weil has also, even in sort of academic contexts, often tended to be lost as foreigner in a slightly, which is unfortunate. And you'll usually find and you'll usually find if you read the papers very carefully, they'll say something like, there's a paper from 1975 by Margaret Fall, I think his name's pronounced.
Oh yes, that's it. Yes.
About the word Weil, and refers to it as meaning foreigner in the paper. But if you look carefully, she also says, but when it was used to mean foreigner, it never really meant foreigners generally. It only really meant these specific foreigners. And I think it's a bit unfortunate. So I think this term in particular, you really have to be a bit careful about what you're reading. I don't blame anyone for reading etymological dictionaries and thinking they've got a good source here on this word. So, but generally, etymological dictionaries are a good place to start. And I think look words up. Don't take people on trust.
Well, can I just thank you for this, because this is outside my confidence zone completely. I'm really delighted I was able to have this conversation, have you weigh in on this, and hopefully I don't, while this channel is not exactly a massive celebrity YouTube channel, I think it will provide somewhere online where people can go for a conversation about this to back up the other styles of posts and on different media. So I really appreciate this, Gareth, you taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. And in the description we'll put links to you and your social media, if that's okay, so people can follow up and learn more.
Great, and thank you so much. It's been great. It's been a really great opportunity, and a great opportunity to meet you as well.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow Archaeodeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.